Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of What to Think, VentureBeat's technology news podcast. Today's episode is part of our Innovation Engines series sponsored by Pivotal Tracker, and today's guest is Kakul Srivastava. She's the VP of Product Management at GitHub. But first, Jordan Novett and I are going to bring you the news. Jordan, how's it going?
It is going well. I am looking forward to taking a few days off for the holidays. How about you?
The same. I'm actually gearing up to launch right into the holidays after we record this very podcast. So maybe my family will be sitting around the Christmas tree drinking spiked eggnog and listening to the VentureBeat podcast.
Excellent.
Well, since it's a slow week for actual news, I thought we would do a little year in review action here. And the thing that I think is at the top of most people's minds in Silicon Valley anyway, in the tech world, is this whole, oh my God, the bubble is ending, or is the bubble ending, or what's going to happen to all these unicorns thing. Mm-hmm. And it's because, there were a lot of unicorns, a lot of billion-dollar startups this year.
It feels like every time you walk around a corner, there's another one.
I know, and I forget who it was. Maybe it was Mike Maples who said that if you wind up and find yourself in a room full of unicorns, you're probably dreaming. I think there were maybe over 100 of these billion-dollar startups at some point this year. But some of them, like Snapchat, have had their valuations adjusted. Snapchat is certainly still a unicorn, but
I think 25% of their value has gone down from 16 to about $12 billion. But hey,
right,
that's more than VentureBeat. I mean, we have to...
Exactly. I mean, I don't know. What do you think, Jordan? Is this just like the first sign of the impending financial apocalypse? Or as our friend Vineet Jain wrote, is this a unicorn death march?
It seems that it's no longer as impressive as it was just a couple of years ago to be a billion-dollar startup. We just talked with Josh Reeves from Gusto, which used to be named Zen Payroll, which provides HR services in the cloud. And the valuation was $650 million as of about 6 months ago, I think. I have to go back. Recently, they added around $30 million for a complete $50 million round. And just offhand, he told Ken Young, our writer who was covering the story, we've added a few $100 million to our valuation. It was like, no big deal. It was not something that you would want to celebrate. And the next thing you know, everyone is talking now about how they are officially a unicorn, but it just doesn't have the sexiness that it had because VCs are doling out so much capital right now and are getting excited, it seems like, about anything that they can fund before it's too late.
And I think there's another aspect to this that often goes unremarked, which is that many of these later stage investments have ratchets, which means the VCs who invest at this stage have a clause in the investment contract that says we're going to get 2x our money out before anybody else, or we're going to get 3x our money out, which means that they have some really significant protection even if the value of the company goes down. So what that means is the VCs who are investing at that stage may not actually believe that the company is worth $1 billion because they're going to make money even if it's worth only $500 million. So that leads to an inflation in valuations.
What does that mean, though, for the rise? Do you think that just explains why there are more of these types of companies?
Well, it's a little bit of that. It's also just there's a lot of capital in the market.
Yeah, I think it's closer to that. Absolutely.
And when you've got lots of capital chasing a few good opportunities, then the few good opportunities get to raise their prices a lot. And they bring everybody else along with them. What
did Vineet conclude? I'm curious because I think at least after the bubble burst, we're going to continue to see a lot of investments because the VCs still have a lot of money to deploy. But I wonder what Vineet was proposing.
His thing is basically, this is not just gambling. Gambling is not a real business, basically. Business leaders need to focus on the fundamentals.
Revenue?
Exactly. Revenue, build a product that people actually want, plan for the long term, and buckle down because it may be a bumpy year ahead. So that's his conclusion. I think that lines up pretty well with general business advice and what I think too.
Definitely.
So as long as we're looking back at 2015, let's talk about Microsoft and Windows 10. Kind of a big year for the Redmond giant, wasn't it?
They seem to have turned a corner and they did not become a unicorn. They did not buy any unicorn, but they injected more excitement into themselves after getting a new CEO, Satya Nadella. And I have seen, even just in the past 24 hours, a desire to execute on this mobile first and cloud first strategy that they've all drilled into our heads about them focusing on it and everyone else focusing now on it. They bought Taco. And this is an app for messaging, for calls, and for teleconferencing. And it's very mobile friendly. I don't know how many customers they had, but it was in the thousands of businesses that were using, apparently, this product.
This is the company that was started by Ray Ozzie, who's a former Microsoft exec and left when he sort of fell out of the running as the next CEO of Microsoft. He also joined Microsoft through an earlier acquisition, which was Groove, I think. He's one of the founders of Notes, Lotus Notes, from way back. So he's a pretty experienced team.
Yes. And I think that the really interesting thing, though, is that it's a good app. It's an app that people are excited about using, and it's gotten a lot of positive sentiment around it since it launched a couple of years ago. And so you have Wunderlist, you have Acompli, the email app that now everyone is talking about. It's basically revitalized the Outlook on mobile app. And everyone's like, oh, I hope that some of the good things about Outlook are now going to come to the desktop. People are talking about Outlook in a positive way. Geez, that's a big deal.
That hasn't happened in years.
Yeah. And so the other thing is people are actually saying, these Windows PCs aren't complete baloney. They might be what I want to get for the holidays, which is totally also a sentiment that hasn't been expressed in many years, I feel like. I haven't seen such positive sentiment around Windows in a decade, I would say.
I would agree with that. And, I'm using Windows 10 now, and it's fine, actually. I mean, in a weird way, the shift to the cloud has made it possible for you to use any operating system at all. So if you're not terribly attached to, say, Mac apps, you might as well use a Windows machine if you're doing most of your stuff in the cloud anyways, with Google Docs or online photo editors or, online productivity suites or Salesforce or what have you.
And then the final thing that I'll say about Microsoft is that the Surface looks better than ever right now.
Yes.
Apple has done the iPad Pro, which is sort of a start at a tablet that can compute more work. And the Pixel C from Google is running Android just like the iPad Pro is running iOS, and it's not fully a work computer.
It's disappointed many people.
Yeah, and the Surface can run everything. Whatever you want to throw at it, whatever desktop app you got, it can run it. And that is a good thing for Microsoft. A couple of years ago, they were doing this $900 million write-down, and everyone had, negative sentiment about the product, about the Surface. Who needs it? It's on a full laptop, but now everyone's copying them. Yep. And they're in a position of strength going into the next year for sure.
Isn't that interesting? Well, let's talk about the final trend, and that's virtual reality. I think it was kind of a virtual reality's year, 2015. What do you think, Jordan?
I have been asking myself this question, and I have to say no, because it would be 2014 that was the year of virtual reality when Facebook bought Oculus. And also when Google launched the Cardboard. I would say that, therefore, this is not the year. What I can say is Samsung has a product that looks pretty great. It's based on Oculus's technology. You put the
Gear VR
Galaxy S6, and you have this great screen. You have the great computing power. Also, HTC is working on a model that's similar.
Yes.
But it's not out yet. They've delayed it, I think, 2 times now. So there's a lot of excitement because developers have real hardware to test out. There are HoloLens developer kits coming out.
I will say this about 2015, though. Google Cardboard first came out last year, but in 2015, it was the year that the New York Times sent out 1 million Cardboard units with their newspaper subscriptions. Visa and Bank of America sent out 10,000 Google Cardboard headsets so you could watch the Patriots play football.
Yes.
And the Times, now that those cardboards are out there, is starting to produce 3D, interactive, sort of virtual reality news features. So it sort of feels like the ball is rolling this year in a way that it wasn't the year before. Like these things are real now that we've been talking about for the past several years.
Yes, and there are several startups that have their own, I would say, platforms for content. For example, there's Jaunt, and there's Verse, spelled VRSE, that are not only having their own videos that they produce, usually with partners to pay for it, but also they have their own cameras that they're filming all this stuff in very impressive 3-dimensional video and audio. And I don't know who's going to be the next crucial VR startup. Definitely the big companies, the large publicly traded tech companies have their own systems in place. And the other thing you have to say is Apple is definitely working on something. Mm-hmm. They bought a startup called Meta.io midway through this year, and they haven't said anything about what they'll be doing with it.
That's right. And they probably won't.
Until the next operating system of iOS. Maybe if they're smart, they'll have iOS 10 running across not only the latest iPhones, but also their VR hardware, their headset of some kind.
That would make things really interesting, Jordan.
We'll be watching. We'll definitely be.
Absolutely. All right, well, we are just about out of time for the news segment. I'm going to do a little quick thank you to our sponsor. The What to Think Innovation Engine podcast is brought to you by Pivotal Tracker. It's an agile tool, and it's been organizing software teams since 2006. It has a simple drag-and-drop interface and a structured workflow, which lets developers, product managers, and designers work together to build and manage better software one story at a time. And you, the listeners of What to Think, can go to pivotaltracker.com and sign up for a free 30-day trial to start delivering better software now. And now I'd like to introduce Kakul Srivastava. She is the head of product management at GitHub. So welcome to the show, Kakul.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So you're relatively new in this role. Tell me what that means, head of product management.
Sure. So I joined 4 months ago, and I head up our product management team, our design team, our user research team, and recently also our marketing team. So a lot of our developer outreach and a lot of the other cool marketing stuff that we do.
Okay, so any kind of new product that's coming out of GitHub, you're somehow involved in.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so for people who are listening who maybe have heard of GitHub because it raised a bunch of money and has a really cool like Oval Office entryway. It's very impressive, by the way, if you're listening. It looks exactly like the Oval Office. Our readers may have heard of GitHub but not know exactly what it does. So can you describe, how do you explain what GitHub is?
Probably the best known way that people use GitHub is that people use GitHub to collaborate on writing software together. And so we're often associated very closely with the open source movement. A lot of the large open source projects are hosted on GitHub, and hundreds or thousands of developers come together to work on building these projects together.
Right.
Increasingly, we also have a very large enterprise business where big companies or small companies, all different sizes of companies, are saying, we'd like a GitHub that we can use inside our company to connect our community of developers, to allow them to collaborate with each other on projects as well, just like people do in the outside world on github.com. Mm-hmm. We're seeing that grow pretty dramatically. And what's really driving that growth is developers who work on open source projects or who work on their own personal projects in the outside world also often end up working at technology companies or companies in general building software, and they know and love us in one part of their world. They want to know and love us in their core work environment as well. So to some extent, developers are pulling us into the enterprise because they really like the product that we provide.
I would have to say at this point, there's probably not a developer on the planet who hasn't heard of GitHub, and probably the majority of them actually use it in one way or another, right?
We'd like to think that, but the world of developers is increasing dramatically. I recently hosted a panel of some of our key customers, and we had a major retail store, a large company that works in locomotives, a tractor company, and a car company. Mm-hmm. On stage, and each one of them described themselves as a software company.
Wow.
So, that's really powerful. One of our investors is famous for saying software is eating the world. We think the opposite. We think the world is eating software, and everyone is becoming a software developer to some extent. So just at GitHub itself, we have...
Somehow that's a much less terrifying way of turning Mark Andreessen's phrase. I like that better, actually.
We like it too.
Software is tasty. Let's eat some software.
It's yummy, crunchy code. So what they're seeing is, they're seeing data scientists use GitHub to do work. Mm-hmm. We're seeing lawyers use GitHub to do work. increasingly we see blueprints for 3D objects on GitHub. So it's really interesting how software is becoming much more accessible and taking on these new and different forms. I tell the story of the two tractors. One of our members is a farmer in Canada, and he learned how to program on GitHub and found an open source community that was working on autonomous driving vehicles and software related to that. And he wrote his own software to drive his tractor in the field. And that's one very interesting use case of what happens on GitHub. And on the other side, there's a well-known tractor company that has, an innovation lab in Germany, and they've got a global community of software developers in their company, and they're using GitHub to connect their community of developers. So it's, open source, individual developer on one side, and on the other side, you've got all of these companies that were old world businesses to some extent, increasingly becoming software businesses and using GitHub to enable that.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about the company's relationship to open source and kind of where that came from. Because GitHub comes from Git, right? Which is it a command or a protocol for checking code out of a code library?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
So what GitHub did was create sort of a central Git library that people could check code into and out of. Is that a fair way to describe it?
What we allow people to do is create repositories, which are basically a container for code, and you can choose to share that code publicly and invite other people to collaborate with you on it, or you can share that code privately. So for example, when I was running my startup, tomfoolery.com, we used GitHub for all of our code development, but we shared our code privately within the company itself. But because GitHub allows that sharing and collaborating of code, we've found that we've enabled many open source communities to flourish on GitHub.
Okay, they came out of an open source kind of framework for sharing code first.
That's
correct?
right.
Okay. Is the enterprise version of GitHub that you mentioned, is that where the company makes its money then?
Revenue stream is pretty diverse, and it spans both sides of our business, right? So it spans the individual developers and organizations that use github.com to share and collaborate, as well as the enterprise business. We don't really share specific numbers, but it's a pretty healthy mix across all of those.
Okay, so you have individuals and small companies as well as
enterprises that
for all different kind of
features and capabilities.
Products.
Yep.
Okay. Is it fair to call GitHub a platform?
It's very much a platform. We think about ourselves as a platform quite a bit, and I think
what does that mean to you?
For me, that means that it's not just about GitHub succeeding. It's about everyone in our ecosystem succeeding. And that's really our purpose, right? So, if you were to look at what's sort of tattooed in the hearts of most GitHub employees, you would see that we want to put developers first. They're our alpha and our omega. So as long as we're enabling them to be successful, we're going to be successful. Like the more developers who are happy and enjoying writing code, GitHub will have a place in the world. The second thing is there are a lot of companies that are trying to serve developers in different ways. There's testing software and project management software and all different kinds of pieces, and monitoring software, deployment software. All of those things need to come together to really complete the developer workflow. And there are some companies that want to sort of provide all of those things, right? They want to provide that full suite themselves. Our approach is, what we call a platform approach. We want to allow developers, and whether they're an open source environment, a small startup like mine, or a really large company, to develop the right workflow that works for them. And so we do that by allowing very easy integrations into GitHub. We integrate even with some of our quote-unquote competitors because we want developers to be able to choose what works for them. So enabling
they
those...
can build on top of it or plug things in that they're already
That's
using.
That's right.
Okay.
So I think we have over 15,000 applications that use GitHub's OAuth, which is pretty impressive, and that number is growing pretty quickly. So we have hundreds of thousands of people who use GitHub to log in to use totally different tools that we don't provide. We feel very lucky and privileged to be in that position. I think that's really powerful. What we want to do is not just enable those developers, right? We don't want to just enable the tools that use GitHub OAuth. We want to enable the entire ecosystem. So if you're using some particular IDE, your own development environment, you should be allowed to use whatever you want and know that it will work really, really well and really closely with GitHub, for example.
So what do you think is the key to making it a successful platform? Is it that really omnivorous ability to integrate with anything else? Or is it, you mentioned developers at the beginning, right? I don't know, what does it take to kind of engage their trust to the level that they'll be willing to integrate their stuff and build on top of your platform?
I think it takes a number of things. It takes the right set of integrations, building robust APIs that are flexible and powerful, listening to your developer community when they say we want different rate limits or things like that. So trying to be really responsive to the needs of your community and building the right features and things that they need. So we spend a lot of time on that. We actually have a big team allocated to that. But I think more importantly than that, it has to come from philosophical alignment. So if you look at the history of technology, it's littered with companies that will have, sort of plug-in communities back in the old days or other kinds of developer communities, but slowly and surely they will start eating the businesses of the people who build on them as a platform. And the way to avoid that is to say, the market is getting bigger for everyone. So for us, we don't want to necessarily be the leader in application lifecycle management. We happen to be, but it's really about supporting the developer. That's what we care more about. And so if the developer is having a great experience and they're integrating with our tool or not our tool, if they're using GitHub Issues to manage bugs, great. If they're using something else to manage bugs, that's great too. If they're writing software, GitHub will have a place.
Is there a balancing act, though, that you have to play between monetizing enough to pay your bills and keep the lights on and keep the company growing in value versus leaving some things on the table for people to build with? You talk about something like changing rate limits, right? I can imagine that might be contentious where developers are like, give me more, give me more, give me more. And you're like, at some point you have to.
Yeah, for us, it's less about the revenue. We're very lucky that for us, those two businesses don't conflict with each other. My background is very much in consumer experiences, so I've constantly had to do that battle of advertising revenue versus user experience.
Right.
And so at GitHub, our revenue model is such that we make money because we make great software. And so there isn't as much of a conflict. Really, the bigger conflict is more, making sure we've got site stability and availability for everyone. And supporting that. So there hasn't really been much of a conflict between building a platform. They really support each other because as we build a platform and as more users are on GitHub, our network density grows and our code density grows. And as those things grow, we're able to leverage those to provide even better experiences for people. So we talk about, GitHub enables this collaboration, when you're actually writing code. But GitHub, now that we are this very large network, we have, I think at this point, 13 million developers connected on GitHub and over 30 million repositories on GitHub. These are huge numbers, and it feels like every week they get bigger. People are coming to GitHub because they're like that farmer in Canada who wants to learn and grow as a developer. So people start their journeys as developers on GitHub. They learn how to code on GitHub. They learn how to participate and collaborate with others on GitHub through open source projects. Eventually, they'll find their next gig on GitHub because GitHub is where people go to look for great developers, right? That's what we really are passionate about, is seeing that developer grow and allowing that to happen.
Tell me a bit more about the role of open source and kind of how that fits in. Obviously you came out of open source. It sounds like that's still an important aspect of maintaining the community.
And so, I mean, a lot has been said and written about open source. It's a huge, huge force in our industry. What's really interesting to me is how the conversation has changed in the last year or so. It used to be that you were either on the side of open source or you were side of like big companies. And increasingly, the conversations about open source and the enterprise. I'm really impressed by how many of our large customers come to us and say, we think this open source thing is really great. Can you guys teach us how to do open source? Can you show us how it's done? And it's great to help them do that, because pretty amazing things happen when technology is, built in that open, transparent way. We have our own, personal investment in open source with the Atom and Electron projects. Atom is very, very hackable, a text editor, and increasingly it has its own large and developing developer community who are building plugins for Atom to make it right for their various development environments. So Facebook, for example, has its own version that it uses for programming at Facebook. In addition to that, we have another initiative. Atom is built on Electron, and what Electron is, it's a technology that allows you to build client applications, cross-platform client applications, just using web technologies like HTML and JavaScript. So we talk about how the developer community is growing, how the developer community is changing. Something like Electron really drives how accessible it is. So one of the most accessible things that when you're learning to become a developer is learning web technologies, HTML, JavaScript, etc. And if you can just start with those and start building client applications, that's really powerful. You used to need to know very special things to do that. And that's a core part, again, of us wanting to make things easier for developers.
So those are projects that you've created and sponsored, but which are fully open source?
Fully open source.
And are you using them to build things within GitHub?
We use both of them constantly.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about your background. You mentioned a startup that you were doing before.
So my background really spans across 3 areas. One is building social software. I was one of the early people at Flickr, helped that product grow. I also worked really closely with what's now the Slack team. Back then it was called the Tiny Spec team, and we were building a massively multiplayer online game. I also spent sort of pretty long stint at Yahoo. My last role there was I was the head of product for communities and communications, so Yahoo Mail, Messenger groups, answers, all of that stuff. I also started my own company and sort of was a product focused on allowing people you work with to collaborate with each other. And so we did really well, but ultimately we sold to Yahoo, so it sort of pulled me back. I was there for a little while before coming out here to GitHub. The themes across, all of these different experiences is really social is fundamentally important. The second is building tools for creators. And the last is the way we work has to change, and is changing dramatically in terms of how we collaborate. And GitHub really brings all 3 of those things together. It's about empowering some of the most important creators in this new economy that we have, and that those creators don't look the way they used to. So making development more accessible. The second is enabling social interactions to flourish. And I love that at GitHub those social interactions happen at different levels. They happen at the level of developers collaborating with each other. It also happens at the level of here's what's happening that's interesting in the world of how software is written, and that's really these larger projects and the library of code coming together so you can see what's important bubbling up. And then the third is around working and changing the way that people work, and we embody this at the company in terms of 60% of our company is remote, and we collaborate with each other using GitHub, but we allow that collaboration across geography, across timelines for thousands and millions of developers across the world who connect with each other on GitHub.
Do you foresee GitHub being used for collaborating on things other than code?
I absolutely foresee. In fact, it's happening right now.
You mentioned, sort of CAD files and things like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. No, it's absolutely happening right now, and it's really fascinating to see it happen. I think there's some things that we can do to enable that to happen faster. That's where we have to sort of balance things of how much do we focus on our core developer audience versus other audiences, and that's sort of a harder thing to see, but I've been impressed by how flexible the tool has been to enable all these other use cases.
Can you give us a sense of what we might see in the coming months or year from, what should we be looking for from GitHub?
There are three main themes that I focus on when it comes to looking at our roadmap moving forward. The first is what I call developer love, right? It's about the core art of writing software and how we make that better. And whether that's, in how developers review each other's code or talk about code, how they do revisions, version control, a lot of things like that I think are pretty good right now. They can be a lot better. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we take all of those things to the next level. The second theme is really around our network, which is we've got this, as I was saying, this network of code and this network of developers. How do we leverage that to provide better and entirely new user experiences that haven't existed before? The third is around being a better business partner. And what we've seen is that increasingly these very large businesses are building their entire software stack on GitHub. And this goes back to your question about the platform. How do we scale and allow them to scale so that we're really their robust partner for the kind of growth that they want to see?
Cool. Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you, Kakul.
This was so much fun. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, we'll stay in touch and catch up with you in the future when GitHub has more news, I'm sure.
I can't wait.
All right.
It'll be fun.
Thanks. You've been listening to What to Think, VentureBeat's technology news podcast. As always, you can find us online at VentureBeat.com, and you can subscribe to us in iTunes. Just search for What to Think there, and you'll find us really quickly. Or on SoundCloud. We'd love to hear from you. If you have thoughts about this podcast or who we should be interviewing in the new year, just send us email. I'm Dylan Tweeney.
And I'm Jordan Novett.
Peace out, and Happy New Year.
Bye.